The file opens with the brittle crackle of wartime paper. Pages yellowed, edges frayed, stamped with an ink that has bled through after 8 decades. The words across the top read, OSS, Balkan Operations, Halyard Mission, strictly secret. Beneath them sits a cluster of names, most of them Serbian, many of them unknown to history, but all attached to a story so improbable that senior Allied officers dismissed early reports as exaggeration. Villagers in Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia had built a fully functional airfield, in secret on farmland surrounded by German garrisons, and used it to evacuate hundreds of American airmen who had fallen from the skies in their bombing runs against Hitler's oil supply. The next image shows soldiers fighting through ruined terrain. It frames the world into which this story was born. The Second World War at its height, each front stretched thin, every nation bleeding. In the summer of 1944, Allied bombing raids striking the Ploiești oil fields, Hitler's lifeline, crossed over Serbia. And as anti-aircraft fire ripped through bomber formations, airmen bailed out into a land they barely knew existed. Some landed in cornfields, others drifted into forests still echoing with gunfire. A few splashed into rivers or crashed into mountainsides. Many expected capture. Many expected execution. Instead, they found villagers waiting under their parachutes. The next image shows tanks advancing across Europe. The war in the West was gaining momentum. Normandy had been breached. Paris had yet to be liberated, and every Allied soldier moving across France needed fuel. That fuel came by breaking the German oil network at its source. So American bombers flew mission after mission over Romania. And every time the Luftwaffe or flak batteries punched holes in their wings, those crews fell into Yugoslavia's broken patchwork of occupied zones and guerrilla territories. Then an image of a sinking ship appears, symbolizing the strategic desperation of the Axis. Every drop of oil lost at Ploiești starved the German war machine. Those bombers mattered. So did the men inside them. Fighter squadrons slice across the screen, their contrails weaving white scars across a blue sky. These were the men who fell into the valleys of Serbia. Young pilots, gunners, navigators, radio operators, sometimes injured, always disoriented. Some crawled into barns or streams to hide. Others limped through forests. Most expected to be found by German patrols. Instead, they were found by villagers, by farmers who had lost sons to firing squads, by shepherds who had watched their towns burned, by families living under occupation for 3 years. They treated the downed airmen not as burdens but as brothers. Bombed cities flicker into view. The Balkans had become a brutal intersection of reprisals and resistance. Entire towns suffered collective punishment for partisan activity. The German occupation was ruthless. Yet it was in this bleak landscape that the seeds of the greatest rescue operation behind enemy lines were planted. Allied landings appear, symbolizing global momentum shifting. But the Balkans had no such landings. They had only the OSS, the SOE, and local resistance factions struggling against occupation. Then civilians fleeing from destroyed towns filled the screen. These scenes mirror the daily life of Serbian peasants in 1944. Still, when airmen crashed nearby, these villagers took them in, fed them, hid them, and passed them from house to house, often under the same roofs where German officers billeted just days earlier. Radio operators sending coded messages flash on screen. These images foreshadow the moment the OSS learned that hundreds of Allied airmen, hundreds, were being sheltered by Serbian villagers in the region of Pranjani. Not 2 or 10 or 20. Hundreds. A scale so vast that the Allies could not ignore it. Nurses tending wounded men appear, reflecting the makeshift medical work performed by villagers armed with little more than clean cloth, boiled water, and bravery. Some airmen had shattered legs, others had burns. A few had endured days in the wilderness before rescue. Serbian villagers tended them as if tending their own, often sleeping on floors so the injured could have their beds. Then generals studying maps come into view. Allied planners in Bari, Italy, home of the OSS Balkan headquarters, could hardly believe the reports. A message from the field declared, "More than 200 airmen concentrated near Mihailovic's headquarters, possible to extract by air if runway can be constructed." A runway, in the mountains, in German-occupied Serbia, under enemy surveillance, impossible. Next, prisoners behind barbed wire remind us what failure meant. If the villagers were caught, hundreds would be executed. Entire communities might be burned. Propaganda posters appear showing Germany's boast of complete Balkan control. But that was illusion. In the hills and valleys, royalist Chetnik forces under General Draža Mihailović still held territory beyond easy German reach. And in this pocket of resistance, the idea of the runway took form. Submarines glide across the screen, far from these mountains, but symbolic of covert operations unfolding worldwide. Winter battlefields appear, harsh, bleak reminders of the war's merciless reach. In Serbia, winters froze entire livestock herds and buried crops, and summers scorched the land dry. But then, victory celebrations flash, future scenes years away, but rooted in the sacrifices made in these mountains. Ruined Berlin appears, a vision the Allies fought toward, but in 1944 it remained distant. On the ground in Serbia, the villagers labored not for victory but for humanity. Women working in factories appear, mirroring the unseen labor behind this mission. The C-47 transport planes that would soon risk landing in Serbia were built by women thousands of miles away. Artillery fire tears across screen. German columns moved through Serbia frequently, hunting partisans. They never imagined an airfield was being carved from farmland less than a morning's march from their garrisons. American and British officers study invasion maps, highlighting Serbia as a region of strategic complexity, where politics, loyalties, and resistance factions collided with Allied plans. Then bombers soar overhead, the very bombers whose crews fell into the waiting arms of villagers. Now finally, the airfield itself. In July 1944, OSS agents parachuted into the darkness, landing near the village of Pranjani. At dawn, thousands of villagers emerged to greet them. They had already begun clearing the field. They had already moved rocks and logs. They had stayed awake through nights listening for German patrols. Under OSS guidance, with no machinery, they built a runway over 700 yards long, by hand, with oxen, wooden sleds, pitchforks, shovels, and bare hands. Women carried stones and aprons, children rolled logs. Old men dug trenches, everyone worked. They worked silently, they worked fast. They worked knowing discovery meant execution. At night, lookouts scanned the hills for German patrols. By day, villagers staged decoy farm work to avoid suspicion. On August 9, 1944, with the runway complete, the OSS sent the signal. Ready to receive aircraft. Shortly after midnight, the sound came, a distant hum, growing, then splitting into 2, then 3 engines. The villagers froze. If the Germans heard the echo bouncing off the hills, the operation would end in fire. But the night held its breath for them. The first C-47 Dakota appeared over the ridge, lining up with the makeshift runway. Villagers lit shielded lanterns to guide it. The aircraft descended, slow, cautious, and touched down on earth that had never before known a machine of such size. A roar of relief swept through the valley. Airmen raced aboard. The villagers crossed themselves. Some wept. The Dakota accelerated, lifting into the darkness, carrying dozens of rescued Americans away from the jaws of occupation. More planes followed, night after night, for months. German patrols scoured nearby mountains but never found the airfield. Villagers disguised the runway each day, plowing it to hide the tracks. By autumn, over 500 Allied airmen had been flown out through the hidden airfields at Pranjani and Kochelyeva. Americans, Brits, Canadians, and others. It became the largest rescue of downed airmen behind enemy lines in all of WWII. Not one airman under the villagers' protection was captured. Not one villager betrayed them. Not one German patrol set foot on the runway. Operation Halyard stands as a rare phenomenon in war, a triumph of human decency over terror, of peasants defying an empire, of courage that came not from armies or governments but from ordinary men and women who decided that saving strangers mattered more than surviving safely. In the vast ledger of the Second World War, filled with battles, atrocities, and ruin, there remains this single entry of extraordinary hope. An airfield carved from farmland, hidden beneath the eyes of occupiers, built with bare hands, and used to carry hundreds of fallen airmen back to the world they feared they had lost forever.